Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Marty Cady, Managing Editor for Policy at POLITICO Pro. I'd like to thank y'all for joining us today for our Pro-Tax Luncheon on Debt Ceiling Day. Thanks to everyone, as always, for joining us on the live stream. We're excited to be hosting this event in such a timely moment. We have a great panel for our conversation today and look forward to a really good conversation. Before we get started here on stage, I'd like to thank the American Action Forum for their partnership with us on this event and the Pro-Tax Briefing Series. Here to say a few words from AAF is Doug Holtz-Eakin, their president.
Right, the government's not shut down, but I am. Welcome to the POLITICO AAF event. I want to say just a couple of things. First of all, I'm delighted everyone's here. I'm delighted we're here on a day that the government is open and conducting business. I am thrilled that the American Action Forum has been able to co-sponsor these events with POLITICO. This is the third in a series. I think they have been spectacular, not just in their presentation, but in the quality of the content. And on that front, today you're in for a real treat. I mean, Washington is noted for a lot of things, and sometimes it's partisanship. And you will find on the panel Republicans and Democrats, conservatives, liberals, but you will never find, in my view, a smarter, better informed, wiser, and more dedicated to public service group than the group you're going to hear from today. This is an unbelievable collection of experts. We will benefit from their wisdom, and I'm thrilled that they would be able to share the stage at an event that we sponsor. And I look forward to the presentation and hope you benefit as well. Thank you for coming. Marty?
Thanks, Doug and AAF for your partnership and for making this event possible. A few housekeeping things. Don't forget to tweet your questions to hashtag #ProTaxBriefing. We'll be tracking those on Twitter. Our moderator, Politico's tax reporter Kelsey Snell, will be following your questions on Twitter and answering a few of them as well. Without further delay, I'd like to welcome this great panel. First, we start with Josh Barro, politics editor at the Business Insider, Jared Bernstein, the senior fellow for the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities in Washington, and a former chief economist to Vice President Joe Biden. Dr. Laura D'Andrea Tyson, who's a professor at the Haas School of Business, the University of Cal, Berkeley, and Tony Fratto, a partner at Hamilton Place Strategies. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I am Kelsey Snell. I'm a tax reporter at POLITICO Pro. We've got a really great panel today, so thank you all for joining us, and let's get started. I guess start with the news of the day. Who won and who lost in the whole shutdown battle? Let's start with you. Want to start, Josh?
Well, I mean, the obvious winner, right, is Ted Cruz and the Republicans who defunded Obamacare and finally got D.C. to listen. No, I mean, the bizarre thing here was Republicans knew all along the strategy wasn't going to work, but they couldn't explain that to a segment of their base, and so they had to demonstrate that it was going to be a catastrophic failure that damaged the party. In order to get them to accede. And the problem is that you implement that strategy over and over again, and eventually you lose the House of Representatives, even though you have a very favorable map that gives you like a 6-point advantage. So I think the clear losers, not just on this fight, but on the ability to drive policy in Washington, are the Republicans on this. And even though I feel like liberals are really frustrated, they feel like the dysfunctional Congress is interfering with their agenda and damaging the economy. But when you look overall at the federal budget, aside from non-defense discretionary spending, where the Republicans more or less have a win by preserving the sequester, the budget much more reflects liberal policy priorities than conservative policy priorities. So it's not just a loss on this specific fight, but an overall loss. We're not reining in the entitlement state in the way that Republicans would like. We have a much more progressive tax code than we had 5 years ago. I think overall it's actually quite an impressive record of success for liberals despite all of the fighting.
Even when it comes to fundraising, do you think there were still losses there for Republicans?
No, I think there will always be conservative billionaires interested in throwing money at some doomed cause. I think, I've been seeing these stories about how, conservative funders are angry with Ted Cruz, but there's always been a set of conservative funders who didn't want this sort of strategy. These are the people who were giving Mitt Romney money. I think there's plenty of money to go around on both sides of this fight within the Republican Party, and this has been the sort of irony for the left. They hate the Citizens United decision. They hate the advance of money in politics, but the main thing that I see happening from having so much more money in politics is that there's a lot more money the Republican Party is spending tearing itself apart.
What do you think? Winners, losers? Do you agree?
Yeah, I do agree. I mean, I did want to say it's great to see such a great crowd here. This is really wonderful, and we need to raise our prices because this is basic economics. I agree with, by the way, a tiny little asterisk, or if you're reading this, a little box to the side, I wouldn't say that the tax code is much more progressive, in fact, than it was 5 years ago. In fact, the fiscal cliff deal locked in over 80% of the Bush tax cuts. So we may have a little difference of opinion there. It is certainly more progressive, but not much more. But listen, I think Josh's analysis is correct. I mean, I heard the president earlier this morning. I thought he actually gave a very compelling set of speech, and one of the things I'd echo, and it just sounds like the typical thing a politician would say, but I really believe it, is that, I mean, the American people lost. This was not only a ridiculous self-inflicted wound on an economy that's still really kind of struggling to achieve the escape velocity from the residue of the Great Recession, but it's on top of a bunch of fiscal headwinds that are already holding back economic growth, whether it's sequestration or the ending of the payroll tax cut in 2012 that was helping to boost growth a bit. So it's no surprise to me that we are hitting GDP growth just at around trend, if best, and people say this may shave about a half a point off growth this quarter. We may get that back next quarter, but there's damage done to the credit system, and that can be longer lasting. Some of these risk premiums that were added to interest rates, they could slow things down. I know the Fed will try to work the other way, but this is all kind of a macroeconomic way of saying we dealt just a horribly unnecessary blow to an economy that's already too weak. I think Josh had the politics exactly right. There's nothing to add to that. I guess the only caveat is that pollsters who I listen to, who have kind of a long view, say it's entirely possible that people won't really be thinking that much about this a year from now. People can have short memories. Now, part of that depends on what happens in 3 months from now. Right.
Dr. Tyson?
So I agree with both the politics and the economics of what's been said. So what can I add? I think I would certainly say it was a loss for the American people and a loss for the U.S. economy. I don't think the rest of the world cares at all who are the political winners and losers in the United States. It was a loss to the U.S. reputation in the global economy for sure, both economically and I would say geostrategically. The rest of the world is now no longer convinced. They might think at the end of the day we might pull off continuing last-minute action not to default. But they do not see our system as a functional democracy that is working in the best interests of either the U.S. economy, its voters who overwhelmingly were opposed to this. What is the rest of the world supposed to make of a democracy in which the overwhelming number of citizens don't want something to happen, and it happens? And it happens because the political leaders who are elected to represent them do exactly what they don't want them to do. So our reputation as a functioning democracy, as a healthy democracy, is really, I think, been taken a severe negative hit. I think that the rest of the world looks at us and says, you are the biggest risk right now to the continued global recovery. You're the risk. You're the risk. The physical, the political impasse in the United States. And by the way, all we really have here is what? A ceasefire, a truce? That's what we have. I would think, I'm looking, I think a lot of the population is looking, and certainly the rest of the world is looking at what are the odds of getting a grand bargain, whatever that is, by the middle of December, given everything that we've just been through? Do we think they're high? No, the rest of the world doesn't think that. And I don't think it. So I think the risk to the global economy is, as Jared said, we have really taken out a significant amount of growth potential this year from the US economy. We were, with Japan, among the advanced industrial countries, the motors of growth. The emerging markets were slowing down, in part because the Federal Reserve has been put in this terrible position of essentially having to sort of look at the fiscal authorities, say, are they going to hit the economy again? And therefore, what offset should we do to the hit again from the fiscal authorities? That monetary response, which I think is entirely appropriate, it basically has impacts on the global credit markets and on the flows of funds across country borders and on what emerging markets see going in and out of their economies. I'm worried that, the next 3 months, is it really stronger? We have consumer confidence now back to the level of the fall of 2011 after the last crisis. It has had a huge drop. We have, I believe, the volatility of the capital market is going to continue. We're going to have ups and downs because no one's really sure what's going to happen here. It's not going to go into a silent truce. It's going to go into a heated debate that, more as time passes, I think people are going to say, what are the odds that they're going to get to a grand bargain? That enhances uncertainty. So increased volatility, declining consumer confidence, continued significant fiscal drag. I mean, Mark Zandi has pointed out that this is the biggest amount of fiscal drag on the US economy since the end of World War II, the drawdown after the end of World War II. This is not a strong economy to sustain that much unnecessary fiscal drag. It is simply not necessary. So the economy is losers. Our reputation globally is losers. The world economy has been put at some risk because of all of this. And certainly the American voters have been the losers here.
So Tony, is the question probably better phrased as who's the biggest loser here, or?
Probably, although I don't think that's well, the biggest loser, I guess the right thing to say is that the American people and our reputation are the biggest losers. And going last means I get to agree with everybody and maybe be briefest and getting more brief and getting to my point on this. Look, Republican Party, right, strictly from a politics standpoint, Republican Party lost rather decisively and very predictably, given the course that they with a continuing resolution with sequester cuts, and decide, amazingly, to swap places with the hostage, right? I mean, they said, like, let's save the sequester, let's say, save everyone, and like put us on the hook, and they put themselves on the hook for 3 weeks, and where they spent every day begging the president to talk to them, when all Democrats had to do to win was to do nothing. Right, and just let Republicans stew. So that was a big loss for Republicans. To Dr. Tyson's point, big loss for the country. I mean, there is we'll see what the domestic GDP hit is, and we'll be able to look back at that and measure it. I can tell you, having spent a lot of time with global market participants and central bank governors and officials and finance ministers this past weekend for the IMF World Bank meetings in town. The difference in views at how these officials think of the United States from my time when I was at Treasury Department. We used to, we'd go around the world, and you'd walk into central bank governors' offices, 60 countries in the world when I was at Treasury, right? We'd go in to talk to central bank governors and finance ministers, and what they wanted to do was to be like the United States. They so admired our voluntary tax system, our entrepreneurship, the way we, inspire, a dynamic economy. right? This is the way they would think about the United States and want to be like the United States. No one wanted to be like the United States of what they were seeing, right? It was like, how do we not be like the United States? And in fact, over time, what we need to think about is how can we distance ourselves to the United States? Attaching ourselves to this train is not a great bet for the long-term future. That's what they're thinking today after this episode. So it is a huge hit for America and our standing in the world as economic actors. And so, who are the winners? Well, look, obviously President Obama was a winner, but I'll be honest, he didn't win as much as I had hoped that he would win. And what I mean by that is, someone who had to fight the debt ceiling, being called to Congress to try to get debt ceiling increases for my time at Treasury and at the White House. I have a very institutional view about this, which is protective of Treasury and the executive branch in this. It's not a fair fight. It's not good for the country. It is really damaging. It's really dangerous. And a victory for me for this episode would have been a repeal of the debt ceiling law. That would have been a great, great win, and that would have made it worthwhile.
That's actually what I was going to ask you
next. Can I just make a quick comment? First of all, I know Tony for a long time, and whenever I hear him speak, you know that Tony is associated with Republicans. And
I in fact, am a Republican.
Okay, there you go.
It's not just a loose association.
When I hear Tony, a Republican, speak, I think maybe there's hope for the future, because he makes tremendous sense to me, and I just really appreciate that. Not that we don't have disagreements. And also, one other thing he said struck me. He said something about, we'll look at the GDP data. Thankfully, with the government functioning now, we will actually get GDP data, because the data flow was completely shut down. In fact, there may be a hole in the unemployment rate series for the first time since the late 1940s. I'm not sure about that, but anyway. I just want to make one more upbeat point, which seems like we could use right about now, which is that for all the whacking that the economy has taken, the U.S. economy, I completely agree with Laura and everyone else and myself on these points. It's been incredibly resilient. And we have thrown so many self-inflicted wounds at our economy. And if you look at this Fitch report where they put us on a downgrade watch, it's actually a well-written report. They say, we are threatening downgrade because of the politics. If you actually look at the fiscal condition, it's pretty good.
Yes.
If you look at the underlying economics, I don't want to do what John McCain did when the economy was struggling. The fundamentals are strong. I actually think we have fundamental problems in our economy, but there are macro fundamentals that have been incredibly resilient. So I think that's a good thing.
You want to follow up?
Yeah, I just, to respond to the points on the economic damage, I agree about the macro damage within the U.S., that there'll be a hit to GDP. I'm not sure that the reputational damage thing matters that much. I think it does lead to finance ministers kind of making fun of you at meetings like this IMF meeting. But I would still rather have this dysfunction and these debt limit fights than be in the Eurozone, for example. You can look at places like, Belgium didn't have a government for a year and a half. Italy has gone 65 years with basically a non-functioning government. I don't mean that we want to be like Italy, but Italy
if you get to pick your country in the Eurozone, then it's easy. If I get to pick Germany, then I'll be in the Eurozone.
Right. But so I think, what we saw in the Treasury markets over the last month, we saw a disruption in short-term rates. Long-term rates didn't really seem to move significantly. U.S. Treasuries are still the safe haven that people flock to when the economy looks uncertain, even when the problem is a problem that is located in the Treasury markets. So I think the U.S., fortunately, has a lot of room to screw these sorts of things up without endangering our place as the cornerstone of the world's financial system. So I think we'll get through this reputational issue. Now, if we actually missed a payment on a Treasury bond, I think that would be more uncertain. But I think the other thing we've seen is that Republicans are, in fact, unwilling to cause a missed payment on Treasuries. So I'm not that worried about this reputational issue, although if I were the Treasury Secretary, I'd be annoyed about George Osborne and other people making fun of me at meetings.
I think we were making a point that it's not just about the Treasury. This is really, I think, it's a gradual erosion in respect for U.S. leadership. And that can be in trade policy, it can be in geopolitical policy, it can be in sort of what happens to people's decisions, central banks' decisions, at the pace at which they diversify their holdings. So it's not dramatic. You can't point to any one thing, but I worry about the gradual erosion. And I will say, I also agree on the debt limit point that you made. There was a wonderful comment by Martin Wolf basically saying something that should never be used should not exist. Yeah. We should not have the statutory debt limit, and we would be better off politically and economically to get rid of it now.
There's only one other country that I know of that has a debt limit, and it's Denmark. And I recently had a bunch of Danes come in. I was talking about the economy, and I made this point to them. You're the only other country with a debt limit. And they said, we have a debt limit?
We're going to go home and change that.
Yes, they're the only other democracy that has one. I want to remind everybody that I have this iPad for a reason. If you have a question for the panel, please feel free to tweet at us. I think you can do @Politico events, or there's a hashtag somewhere on those forms that you guys have. So let me know.
Raising your hand and asking questions too simple?
No, I've got this iPad for a reason.
Just show you.
I guess to look forward a little bit, we had this budget committee this budget conference committee that we talked about. What is it reasonable to expect them to do? Because everybody's went into it saying, wait, we're not a super committee. Don't call us a super committee. Nobody wants to be on a super committee.
Like the super committee was so great.
Right. I mean, Dave Camp famously has said, I will never serve on another super committee again. So what can they do?
Nothing.
That's a little dark. I mean,
Nonsense.
I wrote a piece about this morning, which should run later on the New York Times economics blog, where I said what I think will happen is that a conference committee is supposed to reconcile the two budgets. There is a budget in the House and there's a budget in the Senate. I would judge them to be irreconcilable. So in that sense, my nothing-saying friends are right. I don't see how you can reconcile those budgets, oil and water. But there are a lot of people who really don't like sequestration, and they're not just Democrats. There's a little-known fact. This is budget wonkery a la Center on Budget Policy Priorities where I work, but it's important. There's a little-known fact that when the sequestration kicks in for 2014, the caps on discretionary spending have to come down $20 billion. And that $20 billion is all on the defense side of the equation. Now, that's not because defense is getting whacked harder than non-defense. It's because defense got plussed up in year one of sequestration, so it has to come down. That's some leverage there. So there are people who want to replace sequestration. The question is, how do you do it? How do you pay for it? Now, if that runs into an argument of, well, the way you pay for sequestration is raising new revenues, then nothing. Then I agree, that's probably dead. But if it runs into some other subtle things they can do, some of which is sort of budget trickery, but some of which involves things that look like revenues, user fees, and some other kinds of details like that. They may be able to replace some sequestration, which I think would be very, very positive in the spirit of the macro discussion we had before, the fiscal drag, not to mention all the really important stuff that is not getting done because
if we're going to talk about what's good policy, we're not really going to get anywhere here, Jared.
I'm just saying that
about what's possible to get done. Yeah. I mean,
you don't think we could replace any sequestration?
Yeah. What about just the odds of replacing?
I mean, I don't. Well, I think it's not zero.
Like I think you can do some flexibility. I think that you can get some agreement on some flexibility.
Meaning.
Greater, more discretion for departments on how the cuts are made, and maybe spread them out a little bit. But it is a. I know that there's a belief that the pain is equally felt on both sides. I don't think Republicans feel as much pain on the sequester as Democrats do. I think if there's one thing I've learned in Washington is that the best place to be is when you don't want something, right? When you don't need something in Washington, then people have to come to you. That's where Republicans would be, had they not gone through this episode. And guess what? That's actually where they still are, right? They can do continuing resolutions. They could pass clean continuing resolutions from now until forever. And if the administration wants to fix it, they're going to have to go to Republicans and ask for help in trying to do something about it. Now, I don't know what the do something is. It's nothing grand. Anyone who uses the word grand should leave the room and be barred from Twitter for a while, because there is no grand. There's no way. I made this point earlier today that if we had differences of degree, right, like where you want a lot done and I want a little bit done, we can find a place in the middle, right? When you have differences of direction, you can't meet in the middle, right? Because you're going north and I'm going south, right? We got to go all the way around the world before we get back to a place where we meet. So that's where the two parties are right now on too many issues. And so I don't see anything grand, but tinkering with the sequester, maybe,
That's
but
all
not.
I'm talking about.
Yeah.
Well, how far out are we from the sequester being just another part of the fiscal furniture? I mean, a giant eyesore in the fiscal furniture, but just something that's there that everybody realizes is there.
What you say described is that.
Yeah.
What you keep patching the CR, you lock in the sequester.
I mean,
Sorry.
I feel like that's where we've reached a little bit with the tax code. That's where we've reached with the budget impasse. It all just becomes part of, what you see every day. How do you get past that?
Well, I think you probably don't. I think, and I think that is where we are today. I think that the idea with the Budget Control Act and sequestration was that sequestration was supposed to be so horrible that it would have to be replaced with something else. But in fact, it's not horrible. It's merely bad. And that's why both parties have been able to put up with it. The Republicans aren't even sure whether they dislike it or not. And Democrats, while they dislike it, they don't dislike it enough to cut a deal that would really entice Republicans to join them. The president's line has consistently been that he wants a tax increase as part of unwinding sequestration. So you're asking Republicans to unwind a sequester that they kind of like and give you a tax increase that they hate. And what you give them in exchange is some entitlement reform about which they are lukewarm. This is a party that spent the last two campaign cycles attacking Democrats for cutting Medicare. You have Greg Walden, who runs the NRCC, going out and attacking chain CPI and saying it's balancing the budget on the backs of seniors. Now, obviously, there are a lot of other Republicans in Congress who would like to do chain CPI and other cuts to Social Security, but it's not exactly something the party's clamoring for. So I think the only way you get a fix on sequestration is if the president and Democrats really change the terms of what they're willing to give up. They have to be willing to do something that doesn't raise revenue, and they have to be willing to do something that I think liberals really will quite dislike on the entitlement side. So I think that's why you probably don't get a deal. One thing that I sort of wish would be part of this discussion and hasn't been is, immigration reform, which Democrats really want and a lot of Republican elites really want, is also deficit improving. It cuts the deficit by about $200 billion over 10 years. I don't know why they're not talking about applying that deficit savings toward a sequester unwind or other fiscal deals. Think of that as a pay-for that people like better than a tax increase or entitlement cuts.
If I could add one thing quickly.
Sure.
The only thing that I would add to what Josh said is that you can raise revenues without raising tax rates. And there are Republicans who have talked about that, alluded to that on alternate Wednesdays. In other words, mostly what they're talking about is revenue neutral tax reform. But it's not, there's a lot of discussion of closing loopholes. Now, if you close loopholes and you simply lower rates to offset whatever revenue you've got from the closing loopholes, you're back where you started in terms of revenue. So revenue neutrality would be unacceptable to Democrats. But again, there could be revenues that don't involve rate increases.
Yeah, that, you also can have the conversation a little bit about dynamic scoring and what do you get from growth. And I think that's where when Republicans talk about, Republicans on the Hill, typically when they talk about that,
Not
that's
even
where they're
CBO
headed.
would
No,
go there.
No.
No, yeah, that seems to be
We
it.
actually have a tax reform question here from Twitter. The question is, will the budget conference include tax reform? How, and can you define tax reform?
I don't know what the conference will include, but I do think one of the things, you mentioned immigration. The other, it brings to mind the fact that there is, among much of the business community, although business community's warnings were not listened during this period, so I have no particular sort of reason to believe they'll be listened to during this next set. But there is, if you ask members of I will say the corporate community here, what are their goals, what are their two top goals, immigration reform would be there, and so would revenue neutral corporate tax reform. So it is revenue neutral, And there are proposals out there for revenue-neutral business tax reform, which include neutrality for small business and corporate business. This is an area where there is bipartisan support in the Congress, and there is very strong business support. So perhaps, but again, listening to people who are much closer to the politics here and watching the last few weeks when a number of these business leaders were basically begging the Congress not to close down government, not to play around with the debt limit. I just don't know if those messages are going to be heard. But I do think there's maybe, you know, we all agree no grand anything. Maybe if you could piece off a few things that are really important where there's some bipartisan support, maybe that is the way to go. You don't even get to it's revenue neutral, so you don't get to the issue of sequester and revenues. It's something else. It's reform for its own sake because we think long term it's a good thing to do.
So is that still tax reform? I know that people, when they say that term, think about 1986. They think about big things. They think about having beers at Irish Times. I mean, are we no longer talking on those terms?
I think Congress is not nearly functional enough to do a 1986-style tax reform. I think the best thing we can hope for out of this Congress is for them to do things that they absolutely must do. So hopefully we will not have another government shutdown in January. I would put the odds of that at, you know, maybe a third that we'll have a shutdown. I think they will probably avoid it, but maybe not. But I don't. The question is, why would they do tax reform? Why would they do corporate tax reform? I mean, I mean, you would do it because it's good for the economy, because business wants it. Those aren't concerns of Congress.
Okay, you hear that? Those are not the concerns of Congress.
No, right.
The health of the U.S. economy is not the concern of Congress.
Right.
Demonstrably.
No, I mean, not right now.
At least of enough members of Congress. There are some members.
It is not an overriding concern for enough members of Congress for them to get it done. And I think we've seen the Republican Party is basically ignoring business right now.
Yes.
And that's because business is captive to the Republican Party. They're starting to talk about getting involved in primaries. The way business could be heard would be if they were getting involved in general elections and backing Democratic candidates. After some number of years, when the stock market keeps rising when Democrats get their way and falling when Republicans get their way, you will start seeing more of a shift away from the Republican Party for business. But it hasn't happened yet.
I don't know. Look, I mean, there are obviously a lot of large business organizations tend to overwhelmingly support Republicans. Businesses are much, much better individually at hedging their support. So party in power will get 60% of the support and out of power gets 40%, and it doesn't really matter, right? Because that's the way it has to be. The chairman of the Senate Finance Committee will, you know, raise more money than the ranking member. So, you know, so there's that. But look, on the question of whether tax reform can get done, and like, look, we went through it. We were, you know, in the Bush administration, we did, there's a really terrific tax commission report.
It is. It's very good.
It's gathering dust on shelves.
I
right?
read it.
It's terrific, isn't
the
it?
President's Economic Recovery Advisory Board of the Obama administration read that report
really good,
carefully,
isn't it?
and we embodied a number of ideas from there. So
And, it was bipartisan. John Bro and
I don't agree with
and
everything,
Connie
but it
Mack.
was a good, very good report.
There was a lot of options in it, right?
So is the PRAB report. That's the one that I wrote. but yes, go ahead.
Right, so,
Absolutely.
but, I mean, so like we had wanted to do it also, right? And I think, look, there was a lot going politically at that time, and had a really difficult time trying to do Social Security reform, and so it wasn't right for us to do it, and so it went to the shelves. But it was a terrific report. But what we discovered and what the Hill told us was, do not send this up to us, right? It is too hard. It's too hard. There are no, and this is right where we are right today too, right? It's hard to find winners. Everyone has this nostalgic view of 1986, right? That it was easy, and it was relatively easy because there was a lot more room to move around with the tax code, right? I wrote a piece, right around the fiscal cliff deal, right? Where I said, like, this is good if we lock in the Bush rates, and I am the world's biggest champion of Bush tax rates, right? But if they're locked in, there actually isn't really any room to do tax reform, right? Because it's hard to find winners after that, right? Like the rates are too low, and it's hard to give a benefit to someone who's going to come and bring overwhelming political support. We're kind of in that place right now. If you think about it, who are the winners from tax reform? Are they sympathetic? Are they going to mobilize support in the country for votes? I don't think so.
So
there aren't enough of them.
just to say one thing, I was making a distinction. I personally think that it would be more feasible to, and still not a high degree of probability associated with it, but more feasible if you could detach the business part of this discussion from the personal. I know that's very difficult, but there are ways to do it. I think the personal tax discussion reform is just politically, there's just no place to go. But for the corporate and business, I think there are places to go, and I think we've had some pretty sustained congressional leadership in the House and the Senate trying to move this forward. Now, everyone's stuck by the fact that it's connected to the personal tax issue. So if there was a possibility of deconnecting, it would raise the probability of getting something, although I do think the probability over the next 3 months is not very high.
I think my clients are calling the office right now saying, like, what is Fratto saying? We want tax reform. You know,
I wanted to
we
say
do. We're going to try.
Two things. One is, I agree with Tony and Josh and the following point that corporate tax reform is a lot harder than it sounds. And Tony said this, and it has to do with the fact that if you're broadening the base, you're dinging someone. I mean, I don't know why. It's funny. It's like with this discussion of lowering the rates, broadening the base, which is how corporate tax reform is thought of. There are winners and losers when you do that, and the losers fight back hard. I will also say, though, something that might give you a little more hope is that I believe, this is true, others on the panel may know, I believe that the White House has said, on the corporate side, we would do revenue neutral.
They have,
yes. The White House has, yes.
So that's a big, that's not the case on the individual side. But here's the thing. I think there's a bit of a disease when you enter the Beltway and you stay in this, this swamp for too long, that you begin to think that that tax reform is way more important than it really is for the health of the economy. Now, I do think that the tax code is way too complicated, particularly on the corporate side. I'm not nearly as worried as many conservatives are about the high statutory corporate rate because it's very rarely paid. The average effective rate is 10 points lower than the 35% statutory rate. And there are lots of multinationals who we know are paying fractional percentages of their profits in taxes. So that's bad. I mean, we sort of have the worst of both worlds in our corporate code. But I think that the discussion that says it's hard to get economic traction as long as we have such a screwed up tax code is wrong. I think there's a lot we could do for the economy and for our fiscal health without a grand bargain or tax reform.
Well, I guess the one part of this whole debt debacle CR situation that we haven't addressed is healthcare. What goes next? I mean, it seems like you're running out of chances to defund or delay things that are already actually in practice. Where do we go from here?
Well, I think the next key thing is healthcare.gov. And, can people buy the health plans that they're supposed to be able to? We're, 2.5 weeks into this thing. The federal exchange website clearly doesn't work. And the Obama administration's line on this is wearing very thin. You launch a product, it's glitchy. The New York and California exchanges had glitchy launches where there was heavy traffic on the first day, but now people are going there and buying health plans and those things are working. The federal exchange just doesn't work and it's not clear when it's going to work. And we're going to get to a point where where we may get to a point where it's not clear that people can buy the health plans they need in time for January 1st. And if that happens, we're going to have to start talking about delaying certain things. And this is the weird irony where Republicans picked this big fight over Obamacare on October when they might have actually had a much stronger hand to play on it if they had waited until November 15th. So I think that's the next big challenge for the law. I think when you look back at the Medicare drug benefit, the launch was rocky, but then it got working, and people are willing to spend time dealing with these technical glitches because they're getting a valuable benefit that they will appreciate. But I do think that because this is such a big change in the insurance market, it's a problem if it causes a big disruption. It's not just new people getting insurance. You have people who have individual market plans that they're on now that are ending on December 31st. And those people need a way to access the new plans. So it's very embarrassing, but it's also, I think, likely to shape the way that we have any changes in the healthcare law over the next year.
I would agree with that, and wholeheartedly. The thing I would add is one thing that as an economist I have found very interesting and quite positive. And these positive dynamics I'm about to describe depend on getting the software right. So this takes nothing away from Josh's very correct points. The competition between health insurers on the open market has been extremely non-transparent, very difficult for people to sort out, not the kind of competition that economists like because it lowers price. Actually, the architecture of the Affordable Care Act has helped in that regard. And within these exchanges, given the transparency, given the standardization of the plans, when it works, you actually have introduced a level of economic competition between insurance providers that is and will continue to lower prices. And I think that's great. If you actually look at the forecasts of the biggest fiscal problem we face, which is the fact that healthcare spending per capita has outpaced GDP per capita by a couple of points over the last 30 years. In the last 3, 4, 5 years, that's come down a great deal. And if you compare CBO projections of healthcare costs between now and, say, 2010, for Medicare and Medicaid, they're down $900 billion over 10 years. Now, we don't know if these delivery improvements will stick. And they're not all ACA either. Some of them are. Some of the architecture of the ACA looks to me, and I help, so maybe full disclosure. Some of the architecture of the ACA looks to me like it's doing what it's supposed to be doing, which we used to call, bend the cost curve.
Bend the cost curve.
Yeah, which probably didn't win us a lot of fans on television, but we did used to say that.
Well, I actually think I consciously chose not to work on healthcare during the 4 years of working for 2 Obama commissions. So I will say that my knowledge of it is, and my reading about it is consistent with what Jared has just said. I did look at the cost curve numbers. They are impressively coming down. The CBO projections are impressively down. As Larry Summers pointed out in his Washington Post piece this week, if you actually look, the numbers now look so much better that the long-term budget gap, that's the 75-year gap, all we need to get is 0.2 percentage points additional growth over the next 75 years. I think we can do that. I think we can do that.
Per year.
Per year. That's not that big a deal. That is
Yeah,
not,
we should be able to do that.
If you think about that number and
That's a
you
great
think
point.
about productivity and you think about, I've been working on this project with McKinsey on sort of the big game changers for the U.S. economy, shale production, big data and analytics.
This is, I just want to be clear, because I was about to ask you, what would you do to get that 0.2? Is that what you're saying now?
I would say that if you got all of those things, those 5 things, we'd get more than 0.2. Okay, that's what the numbers would show you. Now, this is basically dealing with our talent issue longer term. It's dealing with our infrastructure issue long term. It's dealing with our energy environment long term. But there are, if you put these 5 things together, 0.2 does not seem very large. So I think we should, as we are listening, and then the other thing I'll say about health, just because I find it amazing. So I'm listening, this morning to all of the sort of views about, well, we did this because Obamacare is going to ruin the economy. It's destroying everything. It's the greatest threat to everything. And I'm thinking, okay, the next set of discussions from Jim Cramer was how well the insurance companies were doing. Okay, how great the insurance companies are doing. So I really. But I really, since I spent a lot of time on corporate tax reform, I really just want to go back to it and address a couple things that Jared said. Look, there is a revenue neutral corporate or business tax reform, and the way these things have been shaped, they've been trying to sort of think about if you reduce the rate there are ways to sort of take the elimination of some of the business deductions and provide a special deduction for small businesses. So you could sort of handle the revenue neutrality for small businesses too. But let's take the corporate alone. There's an amazing degree of unanimity among companies on the desirability of doing this, even though a number of them recognize that over the next few years they might actually be worse off. They kind of say, okay, I'll give up all these deductions, and given how I handle the rate and the deductions that I currently have, if the rate comes down but the deductions go away really fast, I'm going to have to make these adjustments, and it might be that I'm actually revenue worse for a 3 or 4 year period. I don't care. I hate this code. I hate the cost of it. I hate the distortions of it. I would rather have a much simpler code with none of these deductions and a lower rate. I think we should listen to them. If they're saying that, I'm willing to take the hit, then that's telling us something very dramatic about the costs of running the system as we currently have it. So that's one point. The second point is you mentioned the White House. There is quite a high level of comparability. You said, can you negotiate something when you want to get a lot, you want to get a little, you can find the middle. This is an area where the White House position on this and the camp position, the Baucus camp position that we know, is really, the gap is not that big. It's a gap, but this is where it's closer to your thing. Sit down, look at the details, work it out. So those are two reasons why I think, and I do think longer term it's important. I do think it's important for the U.S. in a world of where capital is very mobile, not just income. Income's mobile, but real productive capital is mobile too. And where now, look, take an opportunity here. The G20 has kind of committed, and the OECD has committed to try to deal with some of the offshore citing of income for tax reasons. So if we're in this situation where we can also negotiate with our partners on that aspect of our reform, I think that's a great opportunity. So those are the reasons why I would say this still might be a really worthwhile thing to try to get done.
Can I just make one comment on that, and then answer the
Yeah,
healthcare exchanges
absolutely.
question? The only problem is, yes, I think you could probably do something in isolation on corporates, but we have to deal with pass-through entities, and as a pass-through entity,
Right.
An LLC, it makes it much more complicated, and I don't know that you can get the support to do corporate alone unless you're dealing with.
So you may have to deal with, as I said, there's something that may need to be done to make sure that if you're taking away business tax deductions, you don't inadvertently hit those non-corporate forms.
But I'm saying that you're going to have to help them also, or else they're not going to be supportive.
But it's revenue neutral for the corporate, so do they need more than revenue neutrality?
Well, the problem is tax reform is like Haley's Comet, right? Like, and so like something that's moving on it, right? Like you get a chance.
Under neutral, somebody pays more under revenue neutral tax reform. It's an average.
Some firms pay
Some
more.
pay more, some pay
Well, we've
less.
only got about a minute and a half left, so I want to
On the
get to
exchanges, here's the thing on the exchanges, right? Is that government running exchanges, right, it doesn't really make sense, but that's what's happening, right? What I would have loved to have seen was like, I would have commissioned like Google and Amazon and like people who actually know something about selling products to consumers in exchange kind of ways, and they could come up with really. I love markets and auctions so much, right? That I wanted to see that and see it done well. But here's the thing: so now we have like all these experiments going on. We have like some exchanges going well, some are lousy, right? Let's like try to tear down some barriers so that the ones are doing well. Let's let the people who are stuck with the bad exchanges, let them go in and buy into the good exchanges.
That's what I think. Let them go buy the good
if California's working,
from California, New York, and put them.
Yes, exactly.
The problem is you can't do that in a month.
Yeah.
No.
I just want to make one quick point,
Sure.
which is about the corporate thing, and not to be the skunk at the garden party, but I just felt, I'm sitting here listening. I'm not. And I think I'm not alone, although the White House isn't there. I'm not sure that revenue-neutral corporate tax reform is actually what we need in terms of our fiscal needs and our revenue needs going forward, particularly if you look at corporate contributions, corporate revenues, as a share of either GDP or as a share of total tax receipts right now. They're historically very low. I'm not sure that it makes sense to lock them in given our future revenue needs.
Well, I guess we are out of time. Thank you guys so much for being here. I guess the panelists, we're just glad that you're here. Thank you again to AAF for your partnership in making this conversation possible. And thank you all for joining us in the room and those watching on the live stream. Have a great day, and we'll see you at the next Politico Pro conversation. Thanks.